Hi, I'm your host Peter Sawchuk, a professor of adult education and workplace learning at the University of Toronto. You're listening to Work, Learning, and Social Change, Foundational Voices, an informal discussion with some of the figures who have helped define the field. In this episode, I'm speaking with Allison Fuller, professor at the Institute of Education, University College London. With work spanning 3 decades, she's known for her groundbreaking studies of apprenticeship as well as her theorization of the expansive, restrictive continuum of workplace learning. Welcome and hello. Our discussion series is meant to be informal, but let me begin with a few prepared remarks as way of introduction to the guest. In a lengthy and extraordinarily successful career, Allison Fuller's work has done much to define the core themes of the field of researching work, learning, and social change. Over the last 3 decades, she has taught as well as led and co-led prominent research programs across several universities in the UK prior to, in 2013, taking her current role as Professor of Vocational Education and work at the world-famous Institute of Education, University College London. I first became aware of her work in the 1990s through a series of widely cited publications she co-authored with Lorna Unwin, the famous Fuller-Unwin partnership. At least that's how we thought about it. These works invited me in a way that few authors could to dive headlong into the field. She's a frequent keynote speaker. She served on policy bodies such as the UK's Independent Commission for Lifelong Learning. She's a fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences. She's one of the pioneers in the study of work, learning, and social change, and her work continues to drive the field forward today. Allison, welcome to our discussion series. I'm so pleased that you found time in your day to meet with me, and it's great to see you. How are you?
I'm fine, thanks, Peter. And thank you for that very generous and lovely introduction. Of course, it reminds me, how long and how old I am, how long we've been going. And I think that's going to be probably an important theme as we go through, because, of course, the kind of sustainability of research and in the future of that, sustaining that is key. But it's great to remember how long we've been going and researching this area, up to date.
Yeah, I felt odd when I was typing up notes on this stuff and mentioning that in a way, because I felt like, wow, I've been plugging away a long time too. But well, it's great to see you. Yeah, and it is quite a kind of an expanse back there behind us, especially your work, and it's so well received as it is. But let me jump right into my first question, and then we'll just see where it takes us. Now, I actually, personally, this is going to be a question about your own work and your own impressions on your own work. I secretly feel there are very utterly recognizable principles and elements of it that if it were a blind review, I feel like I could say, oh, I'm pretty sure that's who that is. But I want to ask you, what are your own impressions of your own work? What do you feel maybe are its, strengths? What makes it distinct? Can you speak a little bit for the audience about, what's your own approach like, your own approach to the study of work, learning, and social change? Can you speak to that?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's really nice to have the opportunity to reflect on that, really. So I think there are a few principles and enduring drivers, really, that kind of keep me going and keep me interested and really caring about the work and the people and organisations that I research, and keep me interested and stimulated. So the first thing I think is recognising the importance of context. And the complexity of context for the field of work and learning research. And that's really been with me right from the start, acknowledging and recognising the sort of policy context that affects a lot of the sort of sites of research that I've had the opportunity to go into, socioeconomic background, political background, been huge changes, industrial labour market changes, institutional changes, and so on. Education and training, of course, itself in terms of systems. And all of these are relevant for understanding the relationship between work and learning. So there's always been that, attention to context and awareness of change. And that, I think, leads to another sort of principle or awareness, or I suppose some kind of sensibility that I've had, which is that we need to draw on different disciplines, theories and methodologies in order to try and make sense of this and create some new knowledge and understandings. You know, it's always seemed to me to lead to the end of a cul-de-sac to try and stay too narrow. So whether that's myself in terms of casting around and looking for kind of new theory and ideas, or working with others who can bring that in, that's been very important and has led to, you know, collaborative working, not least with Lorna, who you mentioned, Lorna Unwin, but also, you know, with others with different disciplinary backgrounds, particularly economists, sociologists, political scientists, comparativists, and so on. So I'm thinking empirically about what's been important, and I think, as you alluded to, I've done a lot of empirical work. I think the kind of mindset that's really stays with me is the importance of really listening to and collecting different kinds of data from different kinds of respondent, and making sure that I've been collecting data from, you know, new entrants into the workplace, established people in the workplace, older workers, people at different grade levels, and in different sectors as well, public and private sectors, in order to really hear about those experiences. And so qualitative methods have really been my, you know, approach to that. But a lot of my projects have employed mixed methods, precisely to try and bring in some of that other evidence and understanding, which I think, you know, adds to the power of findings. But I think qualitative evidence is important in really getting at the experiences and perceptions of people in the workplace and those around them who are affecting the conditions under which they're working and learning. And that, you know, helps to, I think, reinforce the view that workplaces aren't just sites of production and of goods and services, but they're sites for learning as well. And trying to understand the quality and character of those sites, what makes them more generative of learning or less generative of learning, or in Lorna and my terms, more expansive or more restrictive, has been, you know, a really key kind of aim of most of my research. And then in terms of theory, again, I've been thinking about, you know, whilst I've tried to keep an open mind about theory, and we can perhaps talk a little bit about some of the more recent theories that I've used, a sort of key theoretical foundation for me, and this is again linked to when I came into this world, which was sort of late 80s, early 90s, was really social theories of learning, and realizing for the first time that you could think about learning as participation as well as acquisition. And of course, there's been a lot of, you know, very influential work which has unpacked that. But the idea that learning is, you know, is changing, can be understood as changing participation in changing social practice, has really sort of stayed with me, and enables you to take that those understandings into the workplace and really see and value and hear about the learning that's going on, as opposed to going in with set views that, you know, it's informal, it's not formal, it's, you know, what are they, you know, what's the acquisition here, how are we going to measure it, you know, all those kind of things which can blind you to actually the richness of the learning that's going on. So those are some of the key ones. And then, you know, perhaps it's worth also mentioning that the longevity of undertaking this research, you know, does continue to remind you about socioeconomic change. So, and when I came in, the key debates were really about the switch from Fordist to post-Fordist, you know, understandings. You know, we'd had you know, fantastic seminal contributions from people like Harry Braverman in the mid-1970s in labour and monopoly capitalism and things like that, which really did sort of clue me into industrial change and what that might mean for learning skills, life chances, you know, the kind of success of different organisations and sectors, competitiveness, that kind of thing. And then the kind of big picture analyses that were coming out, around that time from people like Robert Wright, who I think was from nature of occupation and what that meant under circumstances of huge industrial change and the demise of so many routine manufacturing and primary sector jobs, and the rise of what he called the symbolic analysts and so on. So those kinds of things, I think, really stayed with me and made sure that I then continued to think about, what changes are taking place, what industrial changes, and what are the implications for people, and particularly for young people initially, because there was big youth unemployment crises in the UK, but obviously other countries as well. And that, of course, links into policy then, because once you get into kind of public issues like unemployment and so on, then you do start thinking about policy. And I think I've always been somebody who's got a little person sitting on my shoulder saying, so what? About the research, what's the point of this? Who's going to be impacted by it? Is there any point? And so I've always tried to think about policy and how it's responding to the conditions and challenges and so on that are confronting society at a particular point. And what are the critiques, and what are the potential policy reforms which might better address some of those challenges. So engaging actively with policy and with practice has been a kind of key defining feature, I think.
Well, I wanted to ask you about that because, of course, kind of in thinking about our discussion today, I kind of jotted down a secret list of what I thought was these defining features. I kind of alluded to it at the start of the question. And I think there's some good overlap, but some new things there too, between how you described it. And it raised an interesting question for me around that clarifying moment of the so what question, because there's a hybridization that you keep it alive in your work. It feels to me like for this, almost your entire career, this business about the so what question, which then immediately asks question about how this relates to training institutes and policy, so on and so forth. But still, robust, creative, theoretical thinking. I mean, you kind of harvested some traditions here. That's probably why I followed your work so closely, because I like the social learning traditions as a broad category as well. Can I ask you about your multi-method experiences with, because you've had successful partnerships, which is also in a way, I guess, a key to your kind of the longevity and the kind of continuing moving forward of your research, working, as you said, not finding yourself in cul-de-sacs, but looking for new partnerships. They sound like they've been pretty really productive for you, but you must have partnered with people. I'm thinking of someone like Alan Felstead, maybe, who has strength in quantitative methods, and yet you're a qualitative researcher. So multi-methods, you draw a lot out of that for your work.
Yeah, absolutely. And Alan is I think is probably quite unusual in that he is an economist and is at home analysing big data and designing and administering big surveys and so on. But he's also somebody who's very interested in qualitative work and even ethnographic work, as a participant in the research. So Alan was, a very lovely person to work with, really, if you're interested in case study work and mixed methods. I mean, I think it is important because there's something about going into the sites which you're interested in, which elevates your understanding in indirect ways. So, going into a factory, kind of smelling the manufacturing process, seeing the artifacts, around. So, for example, I'm immediately taken to a firm we undertook some research in Northern Ireland, which manufactured wheels for cars, and they had on the walls they had lots of spreadsheets which were indicating, you know, the production targets and how they were doing against them, and various other things and so on. And it was very close to the actual manufacturing process, and people were going up and looking at it and things like that. So spending time, you know, being in a site and immersing yourself in a site, I think, you know, is very powerful in terms of moving your thinking along and understanding. So that's always been something. And then just that sheer delight of being surprised by what people say, and you know, kind of realizing the depth of their understanding and their involvement in their work, and their kind of ability to reflect on it and think about, you know, their expertise and the organization's capacity, you know, is really, you know, quite humbling. So that sort of sense of valuing those experiences is, you know, for me is incredibly important, and has, you know, drawn me to you know, a sustained interest in the nature of low grade work, you know, that's classed as low grade, you know, for structural reasons and institutional reasons, and in terms of indicators of pay, you know, that, and status, that kind of thing. But which, if you undertake, you know, a more ethnographic approach, you know, you understand actually that the extent of the knowledge and the extent of the skill that's going into, you know, a lot of those jobs. So I think, yeah, so I think for me, it's felt really important to honour the kind of research that I do, through being able, hand on heart, to say that I've been alongside people who are doing the work and, in their own words, explaining, you know, what they're doing and why.
Well, you remarked to me once along these same lines that, you know, you really don't look at unskilled or low skilled or whatever work at all the same, because there's these complexities when you have the theory and the methods to explore them, and sensibility. I keep thinking of that, and I forget. Oh God, I'm getting old, I think, too. I shouldn't have said it that way. I'm getting old. The ethnographic imagination. I forget who wrote that, but anyways, but just the methods in tune with the theorization, and it makes me think a little bit about the sometimes the hollow use of a term like you mentioned, Braverman, like de-skilling. I've always shuddered at the idea of de-skilling, because it's just that they use the word skill in there. I know what they're saying. I know what he meant, and subsequent people meant by that, but that it was actually kind of very little to do with how someone like you might understand skill.
No, I think that's right. I mean, I've always struggled a little bit with, you know, with the concept in terms of skill, because you know, it's the kind of terminology that's used in surveys, you know, and it's as if they can be counted and you know, kind of defined and cut and sliced like, you know, salami, and of course the expertise is much more holistic, integrated than that. You know, it's embodied, it's cognitive, it's manual, it's dexterity, it's, you know, a whole range of things, and often takes a long time to develop. So yeah, so skill all sounds a bit too neat and tidy, and we can count them and we can put levels on them and all the rest of it. That's not to say it's not, you know, important, because of course there are real life consequences as to how skills are defined and positioned, you know, in terms of pay and career opportunities and things like that. So it's not in that sense that it's not consequential. It's just that it's definitely not the whole story, and you have to, I think, maintain a critical view on that.
Absolutely. If it's okay, I want to ask you a second question. Well, I guess I kind of posed some sub questions there, but I want to ask you a question, and I also feel I have an answer. I feel I can anticipate your answer to this too, but I'd like to ask you, it's switching gears a bit here. Have there been people or kind of approaches that have proved to be a kind of pretty fundamental inspiration to your work? You've started to sketch them out already, but maybe are there people, specific publications even, that have remained a kind of an anchor for your sensibility in your work in terms of just literature or specific people that you've worked with in the past? Are there people that have inspired you in that way? Yeah.
That's a really great question. I mean, the first one that comes to mind really in a way is C. Wright Mills and the sociological imagination. Yeah, and it's really that idea of public issues and private troubles, which I think for me has been so so helpful. The idea that you can through undertaking qualitative research and really getting under the skin of of some individual stories, for example, that they can be linked to the public issue that you're looking at. So whether that's unemployment, underemployment, or issues with how people progress in the workplace, or whatever it might be, or a whole range of things can be you can pan out and link to the public issue, which then of course can link into the engagement with policy, but which can be illustrated and help to deepen your understanding through the kind of private trouble that you uncover through the kind of individuals that you talk to in qualitative research. So that's has been very helpful, I think. And also links to very much to context. Then we've mentioned already, but just to mention again the Jean Lave and Etienne Wenger work, and their book Situated Learning, learning as peripheral participation in communities of practice, I think it was called. I can see the book now and it's still on my shelf, but I think that was 1991, if I remember rightly. It's not necessarily a particularly easy book.
No.
But it's so rich conceptually, and also gives you some it's inspirational in terms of methodology as well, because it invites you to have a kind of anthropological mindset as you undertake the research. And it has those little vignettes which of course help to bring the theory alive. But that I've found to be a hugely enduring resource for me.
Actually, can I interrupt you? Have you ever I imagine you have you ever taught, has this formed some of the units of your courses when you're teaching, say, graduate students? Because students really plug into this stuff at Lave and Wenger, and it has literally launched thousands of ships of intellectual journeys. So it's really cool. Do you find students really plug into it as well, or?
Yeah, definitely, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
It's so unusual that way.
Yeah, it's such an unusual book. Well, it looks so slim. Well, it is slim. Yeah. So you think, oh, great. But there's just so much. So it's dense, and there's so much in it. But I think people do, and I've even just sort of friends who are interested in learning, not because they're professional researchers, but just interested in it in terms of personal development. Or I've got one friend who's an executive coach, for example, who I've talked to about learning and so on, and recommended the book to him, and he went and got it and found it difficult but really helpful. So I think it's very special, really. But really special, and I also think that Etienne Wenger's subsequent Communities of Practice book was also very helpful as well. I found that very helpful. I quite liked the device he used of having a cipher. I think it's called Ariel, to sort of explore the concept of communities of practice and try and put some flesh on that, which the Situated Learning book doesn't really put much flesh on the concept of communities of practice. And then, in that kind of, same area, obviously coming across Engerstrom and expansive learning theory, and how he developed that from others' work like Bateson's and people like that. That's been influential. I think sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say the restrictive, like expansive learning and that whole, name tradition and that, what you just mentioned with Engstrom, but the restrictive, I find that there's not a ton. There is that one in Levin and Wenger, the famous The Butchers vignette, it's kind of like the quintessential restrictive. I don't know if that kind of echoed through your mind, but I don't see some of the a ton of people looking at the kind of the negative case, the restrictive environments as much. I mean, that's one of the go-to things I've always found with your work, is that you actually flesh out that in not just a an incidental way, as a to move on to the success stories, we have to just say a little bit about these and blah, blah, blah. But I think it's really conceptualizing. I just wanted to comment that not enough people kind of take seriously the negative case, in a sense.
I think that's right. And I think the step forward that Lorna and I took to, kind of generate the expansive restrictive framework was really, realizing that you had to bring together the sort of pedagogical features and affordances that are available in a workplace with the organizational features. So you've kind of got the interplay between the two. So I think that's that's what helped, and it also brings you to the realization that that a more restrictive environment, or a more restrictive apprenticeship, let's say, because you can apply the model to to different topics. It doesn't necessarily reflect kind of bad employers who are deliberately being exploitative, or mean, or it can and it can really reflect a kind of default situation, whereas they don't really know, they don't really understand what's being produced and why, and actually they're really quite keen and interested in a tool that can help them analyze their own situation and think about how they might move to a more expansive, and in our terms, expansive end of the continuum. Mm-hmm. So we were quite keen, and it's been quite difficult. But we were quite keen not to have a binary, expansive, expansive good, restrictive bad, but to acknowledge that it's a continuum, and that the tool can enable you to kind of self-evaluate and place yourself on a continuum, and then ask questions about how you might move to a more expansive end. Because obviously the organizations, aren't in vacuums either. They're in their context, and that's where the idea of and concept of productive systems was really helpful for us when we were doing a multidisciplinary team project with Alan Felsted and Nick Jewson and others. Bringing that kind of economics thinking into it, the idea of the productive system, where does this organization sit in a bigger system that constrains it in various ways? Maybe it's through regulation, or supply chain, or whatever it might be. So it's not that an organization is, completely autonomous and has, like an individual, it's, not necessarily circumstances of your own choosing, to coin a phrase. Same with organizations, isn't it? So it's important to sort of think about where they're located in terms of locus of control and so on.
Yeah, classic kind of categories that are so helpful for people who do learning analysis well, like you and some others. I think it's still pretty rare to have people aware of these kind of other helpful contextualizing, but also functional pieces of the analysis. Like you say, I drift towards labor process, but the kind of production systems. I was taken for a while back. I don't know if you're familiar with regulation theory, French regulation theory, because of it had this system. Like I share with you this idea of got to put things in a broader kind of context, and not just context, not the problem of context, but a functional interactiveness of person in the world. Just getting back to Jean Lave there. but yeah, they're so helpful. And again, it goes back to one of the first things you said. You're not in the cul-de-sac of talking with people who do exactly what you do. You seem to be constantly, restlessly, kind of speaking and searching out these things. I think that's a major strength. Yeah.
Well, I suppose it's that, kind of super consciousness of not understanding. You think, oh, I don't understand this. How am I going to, what's going to help me? And we really had that moment and that difficulty when we, if you remember, we did a study of hospital porters.
Yeah.
In the NHS in the UK, and the case study was in England. And hospital porters are on the lowest grade in the NHS's 9-grade framework for careers. And the grades are formally linked to pay bands as well. So they're in the lowest pay band as well. Mm-hmm. And we were asked by a hospital trust to have which was very interested in organisational development and kind of knew our work, to come and have a look at the work of hospital porters and try and find out a bit more about it, so they could develop, some training and development provision for porters. So that was absolutely fascinating, essentially going around with the porters to see what they did and talking to them and so on and so forth. And what we found was that within a restrictive job design and job description, which essentially saw them as resources in the hospital that moved things, either people or materials of one kind or another, from A to B. So as a kind of almost like a logistical bit of the jigsaw puzzle. We found these porters were incredibly sophisticated in their interpersonal skills with patients. It was often the porter who was the only person or the only pair of people with the patient when they were going down to theatre, for example, mm-hmm. coming back from theatre. Who would calm the patient down, make sure that they were warm enough, that kind of, make a little bit of a joke, incredibly sophisticated interpersonal skills, in situations of tension. They were also, obviously I'm making the case now, this wasn't all the porters, but just to make the point, they were also involved in teaching and teaching nurses. So they were very conscious of how you should move patients, for example, and would be gently correcting at times. They were also very aware of things like oxygen cylinders, and there was not infrequently incorrect implementation of the cylinders and the fixtures and things like that, and they would again have to step in and explain, and they knew a lot about the specimens that they were moving around the hospital, and what the kind of risks were with the specimens and what the priorities were, in terms of what had to, to get to the lab first and things like that. So there was an enormous amount of knowledge there, medical, socio, interpersonal, social, physical, all those kinds of things. So how did we explain that? That these porters are, in a low esteem, low status, role, and so on. So we found this theory of job crafting, which was developed by Amy Wierniewski and others in the States. And that was, just enormously helpful, and then just understood some of the issues to do with low status, low esteem work, and how people respond to that by finding ways of self-developing positive esteem. So telling themselves stories about how useful and they are in terms of patient care and things like that. So that was a real joy, that project, and finding that sort of theory was exactly what we needed to do at the time. And and we would never have got to understanding what was going on if we hadn't been able to find that theory and then apply it, and and so on. So that was just an example.
Oh no, it's a great example. I'm full on to everything NHS these days because I'm doing stuff on nursing these days, and so you just kind of gobble up all this NHS stuff, including yours in terms of work systems, actually. But no, it's such a fascinating work environment, and not just because I'm like on it these days, but it is very complex, and the occupational mapping of all these, the regulation and the dual closures and all this kind of stuff in the hospital environment is fascinating. And you know, for what it's worth, I worked as a porter for 1 year in a hospital, and everything about that. I remember, it's been a while since I would have read some of this stuff to do with, you know, different, especially the kind of low status occupations, but all that kind of rings true to the degree that you are everywhere and anywhere as a porter. And the freedom of movement is fascinating in some of these unique types of positions. And well, and now you got Lave in my head, but they talked about the kind of, you know, spatial availability of of aspects of work, and how important that was in order to kind of begin to absorb culture in an occupation. But anyways, I thought that was, you know, anyways, it is a fascinating environment. Can I switch gears and ask a question again that's a little off from what we've been talking about? It's kind of like, you know, I just went on a little bit on this idea that, you know, not enough people research the negative case, the so-called negative case. But so this is a kind of question that is in that vein. In your research and over the course of many years now, have there ever been things that ideas, approaches, even methods of research design, theories, things that you always lingered in the back of your, that may have lingered in the back of your mind that you might have wanted to use, or you maybe even forgot about, you know, being attracted to it and maybe using it someday, but haven't? Kind of like the negative case, the thing that, oh, I wish I had of. I've got a few of those examples in my life. Mostly they've occurred to me because I typed up this question for, you know, to interview people like you, and it made me kind of go back and think. But are there any examples like that in your work? Because I think it also says a lot about the future of your work, even if those kind of examples aren't kind of taken up actively, but it just says something about it. Are there any examples like that in your work?
Well, I suppose going back to my first degree, it was in linguistics at Lancaster University in England. And when I was doing that degree in the mid-80s, it was a very flourishing and burgeoning discipline with lots and lots of new ideas coming through. And luckily enough, at Lancaster, there were some of the sort of leading researchers and thinkers. And so I got introduced not only to the sort of standard bits of linguistics, which are syntax, semantics, phonetics, phonology, but also sociolinguistics, psycholinguistics, pragmatics, and those kinds of ideas. So yeah, so I think that kind of linguistic knowledge I've been able to carry with me into my practice as a researcher, not particularly consciously, but because of that awareness of power and how linguistic exercise it, that I think has helped me as a researcher to be in a position to think about how I can diminish the power between me and my respondent, my interviewee, which I think has been helpful, particularly when you're kind of there and you're the professional researcher and you've got a title and all this kind of thing. To be able to go in and understand how you can use language and body language and language to just try and equalize out those relationships and be invitational and non-directive as far as possible. I think probably has been helpful in terms of the quality and richness of the data that I've been able to collect. So that linguistics has been really, really, really helpful. And also I think just in terms of in the workplace, thinking about, who can say what, to whom and how, is a useful kind of set of questions that you can carry around with you, and if they were to want to make some changes or put forward a criticism or something like that, how would they do it? So going back to our porters, when we talked to them about and fed back to the porters about what we'd found and sort of played back to them, they were quite worried, because whilst they absolutely recognised what we were saying about their knowledge and their skill and their expertise, they didn't want. They were concerned that there was a possibility that if the authorities knew how much they were doing, that they would potentially find some way to curtail that.
Mm-hmm.
So that was that was really important for us to hear, so that we were much more sensitive to that when we were constructing our feedback to the employer and so on and so forth. Who actually was on the side of the angels, but you could really understand what they were saying, because they were worried that the most enjoyable and satisfying part of their work, which essentially was happening under the radar, if it was brought out into the light, that they potentially would find ways of stopping that.
That's a real ethical challenge of when you're researching, kind of under the kind of hidden dimensions of workplaces with the suitable methods and kind of theoretical sensitivity. It is a kind of standing ethical challenge, and then it works out to be a practical challenge because people are, quite reasonably hesitant to share some things sometimes. So yeah, I've seen this in my own work, and I can tell. Well, I mean, the type of perspective you undertake kind of tends to reveal these kind of things that even actors themselves don't sometimes fully understand.
Yeah. I mean, you talk about get-arounds, haven't you, in your work? And that I think that's a great, that's a great, that's a great phrase and a great idea, that kind of get-around, which again you don't uncover unless you go in there and do some qualitative research. Yeah,
and just like your porters, my people were very hesitant. Research subjects were very hesitant to talk about that. They kind of mistakenly tripped on that, kind of let it out of the bag, and then we kind of talked a little bit more about it. And it's just challenging when you do this type of work. Yeah, well, you've navigated it really well though, with sensitivity. Can I just go back to something, because you kind of spoke, you kind of came around to a kind of a methodological aspect, but there's something almost really deeply connected. I'm wondering if you feel this way, between people who have a sensitivity to studies of language use, everyday language, sociolinguistics in traditions, as you're speaking of them. It's kind of like the first advanced skill we learn in a way. I mean, there's probably others, I don't know, but it's the one that kind of, as soon as you look closely at it, you realize how expert everyone is in their native tongue, and how complicated it is. So it gives you this, do you think it gives you a natural sensitivity to seeing the complexity of skill? Remember we talked about the de-skilling question, how we both kind of shiver a little bit at this kind of notion. Do you think there's a connection there between your sociolinguistic early kind of, I'll say, intellectual socialization and this kind of full kind of appreciation to the idea of skill and work?
Yeah, I think it's a bit double-edged. I think you're right, in kind of highlighting, how skillful, we are as human beings in being able to exercise language. But I don't think we necessarily are conscious or aware of its impacts as we might be. Mm-hmm. So the example I perhaps, that has always stuck with me was one of the resources that our lecturer used to teach some of these issues of power. There was a very, very good documentary series on the television about how what happens in police stations when women go to the police and complain that they've been sexually assaulted. So this is going back to the mid-80s. Mm-hmm. And it was a really powerful series, because it was, the women were essentially disbelieved, disrespected, ridiculed, and the male police officers, engaged in really offensive, kind of language practices and behavioural practices. But it was clear what the impact was, and that their kind of goal was to kind of dismiss, and they tended to get what they wanted. But I don't think that they would have realised exactly how they were doing it. So that kind of analysis of how they were doing it, I don't think they would have really understood that. But the impact was just shattering once you started to understand what they were doing. But if you'd have asked them, you could have got them in the room and said, how did you do that? They probably wouldn't have even realised or understood. They were just thinking they were doing their job, and
Oh yeah, they're completely unavailable to self-report. Yeah, I mean, there's an aspect of this, yeah, for sure. No, it makes it even more fascinating, though, in a way. Yeah. I'm very conscious of the time, and I know you, as your CV indicates, you're a very busy person, and I want to jump and make sure I get to this last question, if that's okay. And it's just it's a kind of an open question, because in part, this discussion series was designed to help new and emerging researchers, and even experienced researchers, but who are new to the field possibly of studies of work and learning, because it attracts scholars kind of on a regular basis who may have started out somewhere and then came over towards questions of vocational education, so on and so forth. And I want to ask you this question, is if you have any kind of insights and words of advice to new to the field scholars, especially maybe with kind of doctoral students who will be kind of exiting their program and wanting to work in this area. Do you have any words of advice based on your background experience? You got a lot of it to share.
Well, I think one of the beauties and one of the affordances of our field is it needs people with different disciplinary backgrounds, therefore people from different backgrounds are incredibly welcome, and can make a real contribution. So I think that's probably the first thing, that there's a kind of nice symbiotic kind of relationship there. So if you've got a background in a particular sociology, let's say, and you've discovered an interest in this field, brilliant. It's this, our field is in that sense needs to be, and I think is quite welcoming, to people from different backgrounds. So then something very practical, and you're going to blush a bit here, I think, Peter, but I think research, that the conference Researching Work and Learning is a great place for neuro researchers to come to. It was one of the first, when I first found Research and Work and Learning conference, it was brilliant, and some of the the people that you meet there, you might well be involved with or be aware of for the rest of your your career, as we've kind of illustrated today. So I think it's one of the only conferences and forums which really do represent the work work and learning field. It does what it's really well. I think the early career discounts and get involved, put in abstracts. And what's fabulous about it is it's an international conference, and it really is international. You'll really have the opportunity to develop networks and potential collaborators there. So that's RWL, big thumbs up from me. And then the other thing is to check the journals that you might be wanting to publish in or starting to publish in, and look at what they're doing for early career, because I think increasingly journals are seeing it as part of their mission and part of their responsibility to grow help to grow and support the next generation, which I think is is right and proper. I mean, certainly a journal I've been involved with for many years, the Journal of Vocational Education and Training, is increasingly seeing that as a responsibility, that we have a responsibility as a journal to invest in a career, be it through workshops or bursaries or mentoring opportunities, those kinds of things. So have a look at those journals and see what they're offering, because I think they're increasingly doing that. Then perhaps tactically and just in terms of developing the kind of range of skills that you need in order to succeed in a career, is really think hard about what audiences and stakeholders you want to engage with and want to have an impact on, going back to the so what, and identify ways of getting in touch and engaging with them. And one way to do it is learning to write for different audiences. So look at what kind of things they're reading, whether it's blogs or practitioner magazines or whatever it might be, and write short articles for those audiences, and you'll find that people get in touch and ask you to come and speak at a practitioner conference, for example, or a seminar. You can then invite them to your seminars. So think hard about how you develop your networks across academic, non-academic audiences, and then the third thing I think is and this I would say this, wouldn't I? I say think in an interdisciplinary way. I think that's critical to the health of the field going forward. And I think in the last 30 years, it's that interdisciplinarity has grown and has become quite normal. But I think we have to make sure that it stays that way and doesn't revert. I think it's something we always have to keep on our guard about.
Yeah, it's a tough thing to balance, the kind of the desire to have spaces like specialized journals, but also to keep connected to a broader world and to learn the skills and abilities to communicate with them. That's a really nice list of insights and advice. That's one of the best I've heard. So thank you very much for coming up with that. It's really helpful. Okay, well, I'm gonna close off our interview. I really appreciate the time you've taken out of your afternoon. It's probably late in the afternoon for you, and I really already worked a day. You probably tuckered out, and I really appreciate it. I think there's special value. People would have read and discussed and debated your work in kind of by way of the writing, but there's always, I think, a value in its own right when people see firsthand someone speak to their work, describe their work, and they can put of course a face with the name, which is sometimes really helpful. Thank you very much for doing this. If there are forthcoming materials you have that we might link to this video at some point, once it goes up on a website, that would be really helpful if you could share those. But otherwise, I just want to wish you all the best. I want you to stay well, and I look forward to speaking to you soon.